The second speaker, I'd like to welcome Ms. Fish Ip. Ms. Fish Ip is the Regional Coordinator for Asia International Domestic Worker Federation, or known to many of us as IDWF in Hong Kong. So, welcome Fish. In Asia Pacific, over 80% of domestic workers are women, many of them migrants. Domestic workers are doing care work as well as household work. Could you tell us about the contributions of migrant domestic workers, the issues they face, and some recent good practices or promising practices in the protection of domestic workers? What unique challenges have domestic workers faced during the pandemic time? Thank you. Over to you, Fish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pompala from the IO, Ms. Samantara from the Ministry of Labour of Thailand, Irene Xavier, our friend, Ms. Swati, and distinguished delegates and guests of the GCM. Good morning, good afternoon for those in the Pacific. Thank you for the organizer and the ILO especially for the meeting and inviting us, the IDWF, the International Domestic Workers Federation, to share our experiences. We have indeed too much overwhelmed during the COVID-19 pandemic. At the start of the pandemic, our domestic workers leaders from every part of the world get many messages and calls for help from the fellow workers. Imagine you get 300 messages in one day, all for urgent helps. And many of domestic workers leaders are still working at their employer's home and try to find a way to reply and help. And sometimes the leaders are being blamed when the workers cannot get immediate replies or help. We do understand that. This is because they are very stressful and left helpless. It is indeed a very, very stressful time. Yes, there are problems during the COVID-19 pandemic, but the problems, the challenges, the issues of domestic workers and migrants have been always there. The pandemic has indeed increased and exposed the seriousness of legal and policy gaps in the protection of the rights of domestic workers and migrants. The pandemic has exposed how deep the vulnerability of these workers is. What the workers suffer is a calamity of the pandemic, but it's more the calamity of the lack of rights. Again, dear friends, not maids, not servants, but domestic workers is the proper terms as used in the ILO standards, international labor standards. Use of terms can lead to a positive mindset and cultural shifts. The government can first take a lead in this. Labor laws should be inclusive. No one should be left behind. Domestic workers are workers and should be included in your employment and labor laws. We notice there are a few Asian governments have actually been taking new initiative in changing the terms and doing labor reforms, like Nepal, who has already including domestic workers as workers, and Malaysia have changed the term from servants into domestic employee. But we need also actual inclusion of labor rights, seeing domestic workers as workers, seeing migrants as workers, the same like other kinds of workers. The case of Ms. Pen, she is a Burmese migrant domestic worker in Singapore who died in 2016 from abuses by her employer, can only get justice only recently from the court after 5 years. She weighed only 24 kilos when she died. With this hearing of her death and also several deaths and abuses before her and after her, the government of Singapore recently announced that they are considering real mandatory day offs for migrant domestic workers. Day offs are not only for rest, a very basic human right. It also allows them to make friends and can be trained so that they can have the opportunity and time to make friends and know their rights, to have access to information, and the access to communication, like access to phones, also allow them to seek help when they are abused. However, it's sad to say that majority of employers of migrant domestic workers do not give day offs in Asia, as this is not a legal right yet in most Asian countries. Working in the private households also make them more vulnerable with human and labor rights abuse, gender-based violence, excessive agency fees that put workers into debt bondage has barred them to escape from abuses and seek help as well. Immigration rules and visa restrictions and the tie to the employers often undermines their labor rights that migrant workers are supposed to have. And the pandemic had deepened the xenophobia and racial discrimination against migrants, with no access to health insurance, with no access to masks and sanitizers for some of them, and undocumented workers especially have very limited access to the service, the COVID-19 tests and the vaccines. In any case, the workers have been organized, no matter how hard and how difficult the situation is. The leaders who receive hundreds of calls and messages I mentioned earlier are workers who are committed to make changes out of the deplorable situation. Being migrants, your fellow migrants are your only family in your second home in the foreign land. We must make space and allow them to be organized and recognize their own organizations so that they can have a voice in the society, they can have a real family in the foreign land. Although it's hard, as not all migrants have day offs, domestic workers have managed and migrants have managed to be organized. The IDWF, especially with the support of the IELTS Safe and Fair project, started to organize Indonesian migrant domestic workers in Malaysia in 2019. And last year, the pandemic, the first Indonesian migrant domestic workers organization is formed. It has now 90 members with very committed leaders. And during the pandemic, and AMPO, our other affiliate in Malaysia, organizing Filipino migrant domestic workers, with 300 members, has done relief work to fellow workers. Despite the lockdowns, the leaders are grounded in the community. The leaders, together with the NGO, trade unions, and individuals, were able to reach out to thousands of migrant workers who are in distress during the pandemic and in deep need of help. And some women migrants who are pregnant and with newborn baby, but left with no money due to the pandemic, we are able to reach out to them and offer immediate help. This shows how important the organizing is. The situation of the workers should not have been like this if the governments would have provided necessary social security and labor protection and include support in health and relief to the migrants regardless of the status. The COVID-19 pandemic is really a lesson for all of us to learn and review our labor law and social policies in regard to the protection of these migrants. Due to the prompt help and reach out to the workers, the organizations have also increased their membership, known by more migrants, and finally, we also get recognized by the governments. In December last year, IDWF was able to organize the first ever social dialogue, the Inclusive Labor Law Reform, Migrant and Domestic Workers Have Rights Too, is the title, with the Ministry of Manpower from Malaysia, the embassies of the Philippines and Indonesia, trade unions and NGO partners, and migrant domestic workers leaders from AMPO and pandemic for the first time ever lead the discussion and get well recognized. We can see we are moving for more collaborations, not only for our long-time NGO partners, but also now with the trade unions, the embassies, and more individuals now.
Fish, sorry to interrupt. Can you sum up, please? Thank you.
Okay. So we have already organized migrant in several countries: Hong Kong, Macau, Malaysia, Singapore, Taiwan, Kuwait, Qatar, and Jordan, Thailand, India, and form their own organizations. So we desperately need more help and call for more collaboration with all of us. You're here, and we would also like to engage a follow-up process leading to the International Migration Review Forum after this GCM review in the Asia Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fish. Clearly many challenges pre-pandemic and during the pandemic, but thank you for also highlighting good efforts around organization and social dialogue. Thank you so much.